The sand tasted like blood and diesel. General Major Werner Hoffmann wiped his cracked lips and watched the last German tank burn against the Tunisian sky. Black smoke twisted upward like a funeral prayer, joining 100 other columns that marked the death of the Afrika Korps. It was May 1943, and the desert had become a graveyard for Hitler's dreams of African empire. For 3 years, Hoffmann had believed. He had believed when Goebbels spoke on the radio about Germany's destiny. He had believed when the propaganda minister called Americans a mongrel race of jazz musicians and Hollywood cowards. He had believed that the United States was a dying nation, too soft and too divided to fight real soldiers. Now, as Allied aircraft roared overhead in formations so thick they blocked the sun, Hoffmann felt the first cold knife of doubt pierce his chest. The order came at noon. Surrender. The word felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he had never learned. Around him, 20,000 German and Italian soldiers dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The mighty Afrika Korps, which had once threatened to seize the Suez Canal and change the war forever, was finished. General von Arnim had surrendered the day before. Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had already fled back to Germany, leaving his men to face the bitter end alone. Hoffmann stood outside his command bunker and watched his soldiers form ragged lines. They were ghosts, sunburned, starving, their uniforms hanging from skeletal frames. For months, supply ships from Italy had been sunk by Allied submarines and aircraft. The men had survived on quarter rations while American and British forces grew stronger every day. Hoffmann had written reports to Berlin describing the desperate situation. Berlin had responded with speeches about willpower and racial superiority. An American sergeant approached him. The man was young, perhaps 25, with clean boots and a fresh uniform. He held out a pack of cigarettes. "Smoke, General." Hoffmann stared at the offering. Lucky Strikes. American tobacco. He had not seen a real cigarette in weeks. His men had been rolling dried leaves and paper scraps, pretending it was the same. Every instinct told him to refuse. He would not accept charity from inferior people. He was a German general, heir to a military tradition stretching back to Frederick the Great. He shook his head and turned away. But he could not turn away from what came next. The American supply convoy rolled past the prisoner assembly area for 3 hours. Hoffmann counted the trucks. He lost count after 200. Each vehicle was loaded with food, ammunition, medicine, and equipment. Fresh troops rode on top of the cargo, laughing and smoking, their rifles gleaming with oil. Behind the trucks came tanks, new Sherman tanks with factory paint still bright on their armor. Behind the tanks came artillery pieces, ambulances, mobile kitchens, water tankers, and engineering vehicles. Hoffmann had fought the Americans at Kasserine Pass 4 months earlier. The Germans had won that battle, killing nearly 3,000 Americans in a single week. Goebbels had celebrated the victory as proof that American soldiers could not fight. But now Hoffmann understood something terrible. The Americans had lost 3,000 men and replaced them within a month. They had lost tanks and replaced them within a week. They had lost supplies and replaced them overnight. The Afrika Korps had won battles, but it had never truly hurt the enemy. It was like punching the ocean that a German colonel named Brenner stood beside Hoffmann, watching the endless convoy. Brenner was an intellectual, a former professor of engineering who had been drafted into military service. He spoke quietly. "I have been calculating. Based on the equipment passing us, the Americans have shipped more material to North Africa in 6 months than Germany has produced in 2 years." Hoffmann said nothing. He did not want to hear mathematics. Mathematics was the enemy of faith. That evening, American military police separated 5 German generals from the regular prisoners. Hoffmann was among them, along with Brenner, the bitter Prussian aristocrat von Schell, the young SS-trained officer Ritter, and the aging veteran Kruger. They were told nothing about their destination, only that they would receive special processing in the United States. Ritter laughed when he heard this. "They will interrogate us, torture us, show the world how savage Americans really are." Von Schell nodded agreement. "Let them try. We are German officers. We do not break." Kruger said nothing. He He was 61 years old and had fought in the First War against America. He remembered something the others had forgotten. In 1918, fresh American troops had broken the German lines when everyone else was exhausted. They had not been cowards then. He doubted they were cowards now. Hoffman looked at the faces of his fellow generals. He saw pride, anger, and defiance. He recognized these emotions because he wore them on his own face like armor. But beneath the armor, hidden from everyone including himself, a small voice whispered a question that would grow louder with every passing day. What if everything we believed was wrong? The coffee was real. Kruger lifted the white porcelain cup and breathed in the steam. Brazilian beans, rich and dark, with a smell that transported him back to peacetime Berlin, to mornings before the world caught fire. His hands trembled as he raised the cup to his lips. In Germany, real coffee had disappeared 2 years ago. The Reich survived on ersatz, a bitter mixture of roasted acorns and chicory root that mocked the memory of what coffee should taste like. But here, on American naval transport crossing the Atlantic, coffee flowed as freely as water, but he drank slowly, savoring each sip, and hated himself for the tears that gathered in the corners of his eyes. The 5 German generals had been aboard the USS General W.P. Richardson for 8 days. The ship cut through calm summer seas, carrying prisoners of war from Casablanca to Norfolk, Virginia. Hoffman had expected chains and darkness, a filthy cargo hold shared with rats and despair. Instead, they had been given officers' quarters, clean bunks, fresh linens, 3 meals every day, served on real plates with real silverware. It was June 1943. The war in Europe raged on without them. The Allies were preparing to invade Sicily, though the generals did not know this yet. Somewhere in the Atlantic, German U-boats hunted Allied convoys, sinking thousands of tons of shipping every month. But this ship traveled in the center of a massive convoy, protected by destroyers and aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere. The generals saw no submarines. They saw only the endless blue horizon and the overwhelming evidence of American naval power. Ritter refused to be impressed. The young officer spent most of his time in their shared cabin, reciting passages from Mein Kampf and reminding the others of their duty to the fatherland. He was 32 years old, trained in the Hitler Youth and hardened by 3 years of combat. He had killed men with his bare hands at Stalingrad before being transferred to Africa. Doubt was not a word in his vocabulary. This is psychological warfare, he insisted. They treat us, well, to soften our resolve. When we reach America, the real interrogation will begin. Pain, deprivation, everything Goebbels warned us about. Von Schell agreed with him, at least publicly. The aristocrat came from a military family that had served Prussia for 3 centuries. Surrender had been the greatest shame of his life. He clung to his hatred of the Americans like a drowning man clinging to wreckage. But Brenner, the engineer, could not stop his mind from working. He had found an American newspaper in the ship's common area, left behind by a careless guard. The date was only 2 weeks old. He read about baseball games in St. Louis, a new film starring Humphrey Bogart, automobile factories converting back to civilian production because military orders had been filled ahead of schedule, advertisements for refrigerators, radios, and washing machines. There is no rationing, he said quietly, showing the paper to Hoffman. Look at these advertisements. They're selling luxury goods. In the middle of a world war, they're selling luxury goods. Hoffman took the paper and studied it. His English was excellent, trained into him at the War Academy in Berlin. He read about a factory in Detroit that had produced 10,000 aircraft engines in a single month. He read about shipyards launching new vessels faster than submarines could sink them. He read about farms in Kansas and Nebraska producing enough grain to feed half the world. Propaganda, he said, handing the paper back. But his voice carried no conviction. The doubts grew stronger as the days passed. The generals ate roast chicken while German soldiers starved on the Eastern Front. They drank fresh milk while their families back home survived on powdered substitutes. They slept in clean beds while their comrades died in mud and snow. On the 14th day, the ship approached New York Harbor. American guards brought the generals to the main deck, supposedly for fresh air. What they saw broke something inside each of them. The Manhattan skyline rose from the water like a forest of steel and glass. The Empire State Building pierced the clouds, taller than any structure in Germany. Ships beyond counting filled the harbor, loading and unloading cargo with mechanical precision. Cranes swung through the air like the arms of giants. Factories lined the shores, their smokestacks breathing fire into the summer sky. And standing at the harbor's mouth, green and patient and eternal, the Statue of Liberty welcomed the world. Von Schell gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. Then he bent over and vomited into the Atlantic. He did not speak again for 48 hours. Hoffman stood perfectly still, his face carved from stone. But inside his chest, Goebbels' voice grew quieter, replaced by something far more dangerous, the truth. The tablecloth was white as snow. Hoffman stared at it, trying to remember the last time he had seen linen so clean, so perfectly pressed, so carelessly displayed. In Germany, fabric was rationed. Housewives cut curtains into clothing. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper because socks had become precious. But here, in this quiet dining room at Fort Hunt, Virginia, white tablecloths covered every table like it was nothing. Like fabric grew on trees. The 5 German generals sat in a row, their uniforms cleaned and pressed by American laundry services. Crystal glasses sparkled before each place setting. Silver forks and knives gleamed under electric lights. American officers sat across from them, polite and curious, their faces showing no hatred, no contempt, no desire for revenge. This was not what Hoffman had expected. This was not what Goebbels had promised. Fort Hunt was a secret. The prisoners did not know its real name or its true purpose. They knew only that they had been brought to a comfortable building surrounded by green lawns and tall trees, somewhere outside Washington. They had been told they would dine with their captors. They had expected interrogation disguised as dinner, hard questions wrapped in soft words. They had not expected this. The first course arrived on porcelain plates, carried by uniformed waiters. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, accompanied by generous slabs of yellow butter. Kruger picked up a piece and held it to his nose. The smell of real wheat flour filled his senses. In Germany, bread was made from potato starch and sawdust. It crumbled like sand and tasted like despair. But this bread was soft and golden, the kind of bread he remembered from his childhood before the First War. Dottie took a bite, then another. Then he ate the entire piece without stopping, butter running down his chin. He did not care if the Americans watched. He did not care if his fellow generals judged him. For one moment, he was not a prisoner. He was simply a hungry old man eating real bread. Ritter refused to touch his plate. He sat with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with defiance. "This is a trick," he whispered to Von Schell. "They want us to forget who we are." But the second course made forgetting easy. The roast beef arrived on silver platters, thick slices of red meat swimming in brown gravy. Steam rose from the dishes like prayers ascending to heaven. The American colonel at the head of the table explained cheerfully that the beef came from Texas, raised on open ranges where cattle roamed free. He said this casually, as if endless herds of cattle were perfectly normal, as if meat shortages were something that happened to other countries. Brenner calculated silently. He knew that Germany had slaughtered most of its livestock in 1941 to feed the army invading Russia. Meat had become a memory for most German civilians. But here, enough beef to feed a regiment sat before 5 prisoners, offered without ceremony or apology. Von Schell laughed bitterly. It was the first sound he had made since New York. "We were told Americans ate scraps," he said. "We were told they rationed everything. We were told their farms had failed and their factories had closed." He picked up his fork and knife. "We were told lies." The meal continued. Potatoes roasted in butter. Green vegetables fresh from Virginia farms. A salad with oil and vinegar dressing. Fresh fruit that had not traveled across a war zone. And through it all, the Americans talked about baseball and movies and their families back home. They did not boast. They did not threaten. They simply lived their normal lives in front of men who had forgotten what normal looked like. The final course was apple pie with cream. Real sugar sweetened the filling. Real cream poured from a silver pitcher. Hoffman ate slowly, tasting each bite, letting the sweetness dissolve on his tongue. He thought about the soldiers still fighting in Russia, surviving on frozen horse meat and melted snow. He thought about the civilians in Berlin, standing in ration lines for hours to receive a handful of potatoes. He thought about Goebbels, sitting in his ministry, broadcasting promises of victory while the nation starved. Kruger wept openly. Tears ran down his weathered face and dripped onto his empty plate. No one asked him to explain. No one needed to. Ritter finally broke. He grabbed his fork and began eating like a starving wolf, shoving food into his mouth with both hands. When his plate was empty, he stared at it with hollow eyes, as if seeing his own soul reflected in the porcelain. After dinner, the American colonel stood and addressed them calmly. "Gentlemen, you are welcome to write letters home. Tell your families you are safe. Tell them you are well fed. Tell them whatever you wish." He smiled, and the smile was more devastating than any weapon. "We have nothing to hide." Hoffman understood then. This meal was not kindness. It was warfare. The truth was more powerful than any bomb, and the Americans had just dropped it directly on their hearts. The pen felt heavier than any weapon Hoffman had ever carried. He sat alone in his room at Fort Hunt, a single sheet of American paper before him, and faced the most difficult battle of his life. 3 weeks had passed since the dinner. 3 weeks of comfortable beds, abundant meals, American newspapers, and conversations with other prisoners who told stories that confirmed his worst fears. Stories of factories that worked day and night. Stories of ships launched faster than they could be sunk. Stories of young American soldiers who fought with unexpected ferocity because they believed they were saving the world. The German generals had been given permission to write home. No restrictions. No censorship instructions. The Americans simply handed them paper and pens and walked away. This was the cruelest torture of all. Kruger finished his letter first. He wrote to his daughter in Hamburg, a young woman with 2 children whose husband had died at Stalingrad. His words were simple and direct. He told her the war was lost. He told her to survive by any means necessary. He told her to hide food, hide valuables, and never believe anything Berlin said. He told her that Germany would need people like her when the madness ended, people who remembered how to live without hatred. When he sealed the envelope, his hand shook. He knew the Gestapo might read his words. He knew his daughter might be punished for his honesty. But he could not lie to her. Not anymore. Not after what he had seen. Brenner took a different approach. He was an engineer, trained to communicate through numbers and specifications. He wrote a letter that appeared to be nothing more than a father's update to his family. But hidden within the casual paragraphs were calculations, production figures, resource estimates, ship tonnage, aircraft output. Anyone with technical training who read carefully would understand the message. Germany was fighting against industrial power that dwarfed anything the Reich could produce. The war was not a contest of willpower. It was a contest of mathematics. Mathematics always won. Von Schell could not write at all. He sat for hours staring at blank paper, his aristocratic face twisted with shame and confusion. His family name was carved into monuments across Prussia. His ancestors had served kings and emperors. Everything he was, everything he believed, had been built on the foundation of German superiority. That foundation had crumbled over roast beef and apple pie. He had no words for what he felt, no language for a world that no longer made sense. Eventually, he put down his pen and asked to speak with American intelligence officers. He would never return to Germany. He would spend the rest of the war helping his captors, betraying his homeland to save whatever remained of his honor. Ritter struggled longest. The young officer had been raised on Hitler Youth songs and promises of thousand-year glory. He had killed for the Reich. He had watched friends die for the Reich. He had believed with the pure, terrible faith of a true believer. But faith could not survive facts. He had seen the New York skyline. He had eaten American food. He had read American newspapers that treated the war as a temporary inconvenience rather than an existential threat. His faith had died slowly, painfully, like a man bleeding from a wound he could not reach, that he wrote 3 letters. The first was filled with rage, blaming the Americans, his fellow generals, and himself for weakness. He tore it up. The second was a political manifesto, defending everything he had believed. He burned it. The third was simply a note to his mother in Bavaria, for sentences that said everything and nothing. I am alive. I am safe. I am sorry. Please forgive me. Hoffman wrote last. His letter was addressed to a colonel still commanding troops on the Eastern Front, a man he had trained with at the War Academy 20 years before. He chose his words carefully, knowing they would be read by American intelligence, knowing they might be copied and distributed, knowing they might reach Germany through channels he could not control. That he described the crossing, the convoy that stretched to the horizon, the ships that replaced themselves like cells in a living body. He described New York, the towers of steel and glass, the harbor that never slept. He described the meal, the bread and butter, the roast beef, the apple pie, the Americans who offered abundance without arrogance, who shared their wealth without demanding gratitude. He ended with a single warning. We were told the Americans were weak. They are not weak. We were told they could not fight. They can fight. We were told their nation was dying. Their nation is more alive than anything I have ever seen. Prepare yourself, old friend. Prepare for what is coming. He sealed the letter and handed it to an American guard. Outside his window, trucks rolled past, carrying supplies toward ships that would cross the ocean and land in Europe. The war machine never stopped. It never slowed. It simply grew stronger every day. Hoffman thought about Goebbels, the little man with the twisted foot and the golden voice, the master of lies who had convinced a nation that weakness was strength and defeat was victory. He wondered if Goebbels had ever eaten a real meal, had ever seen a real factory, had ever faced the truth of what Germany was fighting against. He doubted it. Liars rarely survive contact with reality. The first bullet of Germany's defeat, Hoffman realized, had not been fired from any gun. It had been served on a porcelain plate, accompanied by bread and butter, in a quiet dining room in Virginia, and it had struck directly through the heart.